March 7th, 1945. On the east bank of the Rhine River near the town of Wesel, Hauptmann Erich Richter of the 3rd Pionier Battalion watched the winter mist curl over the dark, fast-moving water. A career engineer, Richter felt a grim professional satisfaction. Behind him, the heartland of Germany. Before him, the final, great natural barrier that would, God willing, bleed the American armies white. His men had just completed their masterwork of defensive destruction. With a series of perfectly calculated, deafening explosions that echoed for miles, the last of the great railway and road bridges in their sector had dropped into the churning river below, a tangled mass of steel and concrete. Richter and his superiors were confident. Their demolition work was flawless. An operation of this scale, clearing the wreckage, sinking new pilings, and erecting a conventional military bridge capable of supporting tanks and heavy supply trucks, would take months. Even the most optimistic German planners estimated the Allies would be stalled at the river's edge for at least 6 to 8 weeks. It was a vital, desperately needed reprieve to allow the battered Wehrmacht to regroup, rearm, and turn the Rhine into a meat grinder. The Americans, they believed, had reached the end of their logistical rope. They were about to learn how a real war of engineering was fought. The Germans knew bridges. They were masters of grand, permanent structures, of steel and concrete shaped by meticulous calculation over years. They simply couldn't believe that anyone, let alone the upstart Americans, could conjure a solution to this monumental obstacle in a matter of days. The very idea was laughable. From their concealed positions, German observers watched the first American vehicles arrive on the opposite bank and almost laughed. They weren't heavy cranes or massive, prefabricated concrete caissons. They were just trucks, hundreds of standard GMC 2.5-ton trucks, moving in an endless, hypnotic line. They weren't carrying anything that looked like bridge material. Instead, their flatbeds were stacked with what looked like oversized pieces of a child's construction set. Identical rectangular steel lattice panels, thousands upon thousands of them, all painted in drab olive green, piles of steel pins, cross braces, and wooden planks. The German engineers were stunned. This wasn't a serious engineering force, it was a delivery of toys. They never expected the war to be decided not by the roar of a Tiger tank's 88mm cannon, but by the rhythmic, relentless clanging of steel pins being hammered into place by men who, just a few years earlier, had been building skyscrapers, farm sheds, and suburban homes. What Hauptmann Richter and the entire German High Command failed to understand was that they weren't just fighting the US Army. They were fighting the full, terrifying might of American industrial philosophy. While Germany had perfected the exquisite, powerful, but often over-engineered weapon, America had perfected something else entirely. Mass-produced, modular, brutally efficient simplicity. And the physical embodiment of that philosophy was now being unloaded on the banks of the Rhine. It was called the Bailey Bridge, an invention the Germans had heard of, but whose strategic implications they had catastrophically underestimated. Designed by a British civil servant, Donald Bailey, it was a masterpiece of battlefield engineering. Each component was light enough to be handled by a handful of men and simple enough to be assembled with nothing more than hammers, wrenches, and raw manpower. The core of the system was the 10-foot-long, 600-pound welded steel panel. By pinning these panels together, end to end, engineers could create long girders. By adding more panels alongside or even stacking them vertically, they could increase the bridge's strength to carry any vehicle in the Allied arsenal, from a simple jeep to the monstrous 43-ton M26 Pershing tank. The whole system was a weapon of war disguised as a construction kit. The Germans had always viewed rivers as strategic certainties, timelines written by nature that dictated the pace of war. The Rhine was the ultimate certainty. Their entire defensive doctrine for 1945 was built on the weeks and months it would take the Allies to force a crossing. They were shocked to discover that the Americans viewed the Rhine not as a barrier, but as a simple engineering problem with a pre-packaged solution. As the first American combat engineers of the 9th Army's 291st Engineer Combat Battalion swarmed the riverbank, the Germans watched in utter disbelief. There was no lengthy survey, no deep water foundation work. The Americans simply began building. On the riverbank, they assembled the first section of the bridge on rollers, With a chorus of shouts and the clang of steel on steel, the men would assemble a new 10-foot section, pin it securely, and then the entire growing structure would be pushed out over the water. A specially designed, lightweight launching nose was attached to the front to support the bridge's weight as it was cantilevered across the gap until it touched down on the far bank. German artillery spotters, hidden in the hills, were at a loss. They were trained to target high-value, stationary construction sites, cranes, supply depots, concrete mixers. But here, there was nothing to target. The bridge wasn't being built on the river. It was simply appearing over it, growing at a speed they never knew was possible. The sound carried across the water, a constant, percussive rhythm of methodical progress. It was the sound of Germany's last great hope being hammered into obsolescence. The men of the 291st worked in a blur of controlled chaos. They were not specialists in the German sense. They were jacks of all trades. They knew how to handle explosives, clear minefields, build fortifications, and fight as infantry if necessary. And they knew Bailey bridges like the backs of their hands. They had built them over countless smaller rivers and canals, all the way from the beaches of Normandy. To them, the Rhine was just another gap on the map, albeit a very wide one. What the Germans were witnessing was a miracle of logistics and training they couldn't comprehend. While a German engineer battalion might be an elite specialized unit, the American army had hundreds of these combat engineer battalions, and behind them, a supply chain that defied belief. In 1943 and 1944 alone, American factories like the Commercial Shearing and Stamping Company of Youngstown, Ohio, and the International Steel Company of Evansville, Indiana, produced over 700,000 tons of Bailey Bridge components. That was enough steel to build a bridge from London to Berlin. It was a quantity so vast, so overwhelming, that it broke the traditional rules of warfare. The Germans fought a war of conservation, where the loss of a single major bridge was a strategic victory that bought precious time. The Americans fought a war of consumption, where a destroyed bridge was an inconvenience that would be replaced from a seemingly infinite stockpile. The initial German reports sent back to headquarters were met with skepticism. Field commanders reported that the Americans were assembling a massive bridge near Wesel. The timeline was what caused the confusion. An officer reported the bridge was 25% complete after only a few hours. This was dismissed. No bridge of that size could be built so quickly. It must be a small pontoon bridge for infantry, they assumed. They were surprised to see the structure holding firm against the powerful Rhine current. They were shocked when they realized it was a heavy-duty tactical bridge, but they were absolutely horrified when, hour after hour, it just kept coming. The German soldiers watching from their foxholes felt a new kind of dread creeping in. They were veterans of brutal fighting in France and the Ardennes. They had faced American tanks, artillery, and air power. But this was something different. This wasn't a battle. It was an industrial process. It was as if a factory assembly line had been extended from Detroit right across the Rhine and into the heart of their country. The relentless, methodical clanging of the steel pins became a form of psychological warfare. It was the sound of inevitability. Every clang was another nail in the coffin of their defensive strategy. They had blown the bridge to stop the American armor. But the sound they now heard was the sound of thousands of Shermans and Pershings revving their engines, just waiting for the final panel to be locked into place. The German High Command had planned for a war of attrition. But how do you fight an enemy who can simply replace a 1,100-foot steel bridge in the time it took you to properly wire it for demolition? The speed was the most shocking part. The American engineers worked through the day and into the night under powerful searchlights, which themselves seemed to mock the German shortages of fuel and electricity. The process was a perfect symphony of organized labor. Trucks would arrive, deposit their load of panels and pins in a precise location, and leave. Teams of men would hoist the panels, swing them into place, while other men stood ready with the steel pins and sledgehammers. There were no wasted movements. Within 10 hours, the bridge was halfway across the Rhine. A German artillery barrage, hastily organized, rained down on the construction site. But the Americans had anticipated this. They had not built one bridge. They were building several, miles apart. Furthermore, the Bailey Bridge itself was surprisingly resilient. A shell might damage a panel or two, but the modular design meant a damaged section could be quickly unpinned and replaced without compromising the entire structure. For the German artillerymen, it was a deeply frustrating experience. They were firing at a target that could repair itself faster than they could zero in on it. But the true moment of disbelief for Hauptmann Richter and his men came when they saw the first vehicles cross. They had assumed, based on all their engineering knowledge, that such a rapidly constructed bridge would be a light, flimsy affair, suitable for jeeps and light trucks only. They expected the structure to sag precariously, to be tested carefully before any heavy loads were committed. They were stunned when the first vehicle to rumble across the newly completed 1,140-foot bridge was not a jeep, but a heavy-duty bulldozer, its blade high, ready to clear the way on the eastern bank. It was followed immediately by a tank retriever, and then, the sight that broke their morale completely, a column of M4 Sherman tanks, their tracks clattering on the wooden decking, moving at full speed as if they were on a paved highway. The bridge barely seemed to notice their weight. The entire colossal structure, stretching a fifth of a mile over one of Europe's most formidable rivers, had been completed by a single engineer battalion in less than a day. The Germans had calculated they had bought themselves weeks. The Americans had erased that calculation in a matter of hours. This single event sent shockwaves through the German command structure. It wasn't just a tactical failure, it was a conceptual one. Their entire way of thinking about war, based on established timelines and logistical limitations, was wrong. The Americans weren't just breaking the rules, they were playing a different game entirely. The recurring symbol of this new game was the simple, unassuming Bailey Bridge panel. Stacked by the thousands on the side of every major road, they became the visual representation of American power. They were not elegant, they were not sophisticated, but they were interchangeable, infinitely adaptable, and there were always more of them. The German Tiger tank was a masterpiece of engineering, but for every Tiger built, America produced 50 Shermans. For every magnificent stone bridge the Germans blew, the Americans could lay down a dozen steel Bailey bridges. The battle for the Rhine was supposed to be Germany's glorious last stand. Instead, the quiet, methodical work of a few hundred American engineers turned it into a sobering lesson in the mathematics of modern warfare. And German soldiers all along the front began to understand the horrifying truth. There was no river deep enough or wide enough to stop an army that could bring its own bridges with it, right off the assembly line. The story of the Wesel Bridge was not an isolated incident. It was a template. All along the 300-mile front of the Rhine, the same scene was playing out with terrifying synchronicity. From Nijmegen in the north to Oppenheim in the south, the clang of American steel echoed across the water. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, the German commander-in-chief in the west, received the reports with a growing sense of dread. He couldn't believe what he was reading. His best demolition experts had assured him the Rhine was secure for the spring. Yet, his field commanders were reporting multiple, simultaneous, heavy-duty bridge constructions by an enemy that seemed to treat the river like a minor ditch. The Wehrmacht's entire operational plan was predicated on a static, defensive battle along the riverbank. They had prepared for this. Their artillery was ranged on the likely crossing points, their panzer divisions held in reserve, ready to counterattack any beachhead before it could be reinforced. But they never expected a speed of reinforcement that rendered their entire counterattack strategy obsolete before it could even be implemented. The Bailey Bridge didn't just allow the Allies to cross the river, it allowed them to bring their full, overwhelming armoured might with them from the very first day. The German panzer divisions, desperately short on fuel and moving on cratered roads, would arrive to counterattack what they thought would be a fragile, lightly armed beachhead, only to find themselves facing a fully supplied American armoured division that had seemingly materialized out of thin air. The shock was profound. It was a strategic checkmate delivered by men with sledgehammers. This logistical superiority bled into every aspect of the American war machine, creating a cultural and psychological gap that the average German soldier found impossible to process. In a captured dugout near Remagen, a German pioneer officer, barely 20 years old, was interrogated by a US Army captain of the same age. The German hadn't eaten a hot meal in 3 days, subsisting on stale bread and ersatz coffee made from acorns. He was stunned when his American counterpart offered him a steaming cup of real coffee, a Hershey's chocolate bar, and a cigarette from a fresh pack of Lucky Strikes. The American officer wasn't gloating. He seemed genuinely unable to comprehend a reality where such items were luxuries. He casually asked the young German about the demolition charges used on the Ludendorff Bridge, making notes in a small booklet with a casual academic air. The German looked at his captor, well-fed, confident, equipped with gear that looked brand new, and he finally understood. Germany wasn't just losing a war of tanks and planes. They were losing a war of coffee pots and chocolate factories. He later told another POW, "We were soldiers fighting a war. They were workers on a job site. And the job was to destroy us. They had all the best tools." This feeling of being overwhelmed by sheer material abundance was perhaps even more demoralizing than the fighting itself. German intelligence officers simply couldn't believe the reports from their own spies and reconnaissance flights. The Allies were not just building bridges, they were laying down entire road networks behind them, using bulldozers and earth movers to create highways through the mud. They were laying fuel pipelines under the English Channel and across France. The famous Red Ball Express had already shown their ability to sustain a mechanized army on the move. Now, the Bailey Bridge was the final piece of the puzzle. The nozzle on a logistical fire hose of unimaginable pressure pointed directly at the heart of the Reich. Nowhere was this audacity more apparent than with General George S. Patton's Third Army. On the night of March 22nd, Patton, unwilling to wait for a major planned operation, ordered the 11th Infantry Regiment to conduct a surprise assault crossing of the Rhine near Oppenheim. It was a classic Patton move, bold, risky, and predicated on speed. The assault boats made it across under the cover of darkness, securing a small foothold. The German defenders were shocked, but confident that the Americans couldn't reinforce the position with anything heavy. Any pontoon bridge would be smashed by artillery at daylight. But as the sun rose, the Germans didn't see a flimsy pontoon bridge. They saw the now familiar sight of olive-drab steel panels being relentlessly pushed out from the western bank. The men of the 247th Engineer Combat Battalion, working in waist-deep freezing water, built a 1,032-foot Bailey pontoon bridge in just over 10 hours. By dusk, tanks and tank destroyers of the 4th Armoured Division were pouring across, shattering the German defences. Patton, in his typical style, arrived to inspect the handiwork, famously unzipping his fly and urinating into the river, later boasting, "I have spat in the Rhine." To the Germans, this act was the ultimate sign of arrogant disrespect for their sacred river. But for the Americans, it was a statement of fact. The Bailey Bridge had rendered the Rhine, and all the military traditions and strategic certainties that went with it, utterly irrelevant. The Germans had never expected this. Their military tradition was steeped in the dramatic Wagnerian set-piece battle. The Americans, by contrast, had turned the climax of the war in the West into a problem of industrial engineering. While German propaganda was still talking about wonder weapons and a heroic final stand, the Americans were busy calculating load capacities and assembly times. The symbolism of the Bailey Bridge panel was inescapable. It was the ultimate expression of American pragmatism. It wasn't beautiful. It didn't have the menacing aesthetic of a king tiger, but it worked. And because it was standardized, every panel made in Ohio was identical to one made in Indiana, and could be seamlessly integrated with one made in the United Kingdom. This concept of universal interchangeability was the secret weapon the Germans, with their culture of bespoke, precision engineering, could never match. They might build a better tank engine, but the Americans built a better system. As the Allied armies flooded into Germany in late March and April 1945, the Bailey bridges became their lifelines. They spanned not just the Rhine, but the Main, the Neckar, the Weser, and countless smaller tributaries. They supported the armour, the artillery, the fuel trucks, the ambulances, and the endless columns of infantry that would ultimately crush the Third Reich. For every bridge the Germans blew in their retreat, the US Army engineers had a simple, three-word response: build another one. The speed and scale of these constructions had a profound, paralyzing effect on German morale. What was the point of fighting? What was the point of heroically sacrificing yourself to delay the enemy for a day, when that day's work could be undone in a few hours by a handful of men with pins and panels? It created a sense of futility that spread from the front lines all the way to the high command. Veteran German soldiers who had survived years of brutal fighting on the Eastern Front, men who had faced the human wave attacks of the Red Army, were now confronted with something even more terrifying, an enemy whose resources seemed infinite. They were stunned to learn that the American engineers often built multiple bridges side by side, one for westbound traffic, one for eastbound, and sometimes a third, heavier one just for tanks. This level of logistical luxury was something a German quartermaster, struggling to find enough hay for his unit's horses, couldn't even imagine in his wildest dreams. It was a war won by the quartermaster and the engineer, as much as the infantryman and the tanker. The clanging sound of the Bailey Bridge construction, that rhythmic hammering of steel on steel, was the final, definitive sound of the war on the Western Front. It was the sound of an industrial superpower, methodically disassembling an enemy war machine that had run out of time, fuel, and hope. It was the sound of a new world being built atop the ruins of the old, 10-foot panel at a time. The Germans laughed in 1940 when they blitzed through France, their engineers rapidly throwing up pontoon bridges. They never knew that on the other side of the Atlantic, an industrial giant was perfecting a system that would make their best efforts look like child's play. They had started the war with a new way of fighting. The Americans were about to end it with a new way of winning. In the final accounting of the war, after the unconditional surrender was signed and the full scope of the Allied achievement could be properly assessed, the story of the Bailey Bridge emerged as a legend of military engineering. The numbers alone were so staggering that German generals held in Allied captivity initially refused to believe them. They were convinced it was mere propaganda. Over the course of the war, more than 200 miles of Bailey bridging were deployed in the European theatre alone. Laid end to end, the panels produced by American and British factories could have spanned the English Channel 10 times over. They were used in every theatre, from the humid jungles of Burma, where engineers built a 1,100-foot bridge over the Rhine River, to the rugged mountains of Italy, where they threw a vital bridge across the Sangro River under constant German artillery fire. It became the ubiquitous, indispensable tool of Allied victory. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, one of Germany's most respected commanders, remarked in a post-war interrogation that the Allies' ability to cross rivers in a matter of hours was something his own forces simply could not have done. The statement, delivered with the weary resignation of a man who had seen his profession fundamentally rewritten by a foreign power, was the ultimate admission of conceptual defeat. The Germans, who had prided themselves on being the world's greatest engineers, had been decisively out-engineered. They had focused on building the perfect weapon. The Americans had focused on building the perfect system to deliver those weapons anywhere, at any time, in overwhelming numbers. The final irony, a detail that the Germans found both humiliating and baffling, was what happened after the fighting stopped. In the shattered landscape of post-war Germany, with its cities in ruins and its infrastructure obliterated, the Bailey Bridge entered a new phase of its life. The same olive-drab panels that had carried Sherman tanks to crush the Third Reich were now used by Allied occupation forces to rebuild the very nation they had just defeated. They spanned the craters where magnificent stone bridges had once stood, allowing convoys of trucks carrying food, medicine, and building materials from the Marshall Plan to reach the starving German population. A German civilian in Cologne, watching American engineers erect a Bailey Bridge over the Rhine in 1946 to restore a critical transport link, was stunned by the familiar, efficient clanging of the steel pins. He remarked to a journalist, "It is the sound of our defeat, but now it is also the sound of our survival." The Americans had brought a weapon of war so versatile, so fundamentally constructive in its design, that its immediate and most natural peacetime application was to rebuild civilization. It was a concept so alien to the Nazi philosophy of glorious destruction that it served as a final, profound lesson in the difference between the two powers. The story of the P-47 Thunderbolt, which began with German laughter, had its parallel in the story of the Bailey Bridge. Both were initially dismissed. Both were symbols of an American philosophy of brute force elegance, of good-enough pragmatism scaled to a level of industrial might the world had never before seen. The sleek, agile Messerschmitt was a fencer's rapier. The P-47 was a sledgehammer. A traditional German bridge was a work of art. The Bailey was a length of steel pipe, brutally effective and infinitely replaceable. The German war machine was a finely tuned, exquisite watch that eventually broke. The American war machine was a simple, rugged alarm clock that never stopped ringing, produced by the million. In the end, the alarm clock won. The transformation was complete. The laughing German engineers of early 1945, so confident in their destructive handiwork, were replaced by the silent, grim-faced prisoners of war just a few months later, watching the endless columns of American might pour over rivers they had sworn were impassable. They had believed the timeless truths of geography and the hard-won lessons of traditional engineering would give them the time they needed to save their regime. They couldn't believe, they never expected, that the enemy would simply ignore the rule-book and bring their own roads with them. The great rivers of Germany, the sacred guardians of the fatherland, had been reduced to mere inconveniences on an American military map, obstacles to be bridged and bypassed in a single shift. The laughter had died. The shock had given way to a final, bitter understanding. They had been beaten not just by soldiers, but by a system, an avalanche of steel and ingenuity that, once unleashed, could never be stopped.